Hello and welcome to another How to Get Better at Chess video in which I review a game from the past featuring some of the greatest masters. And today's chess games, with current masters, they use a lot of computer analysis to help assist them in deciding what to play. And the games can be a lot more complicated. So especially if you're a beginner player, and you're just starting out, it can help to look at older games, played from 100 years ago or more, or even 50 years ago. Just older games in general, they'll kind of be a little easier to understand because they didn't rely on, crazy computer analysis back then. So let's take a look at this game. It was played in 1914 in St. Petersburg, Russia. Joseph Blackburn had the white pieces, and he's playing against Aaron Nimzowitsch, who was one of the top players in the early 1900s. Now, Blackburn, he was, more famous in the 1800s. He was about in his 70s during this game, so I think this game was played 10 years before he died or about that. So let's take a look at it. It looks like an interesting game. Blackburn even had a brilliant move in this game. So I'll turn on the computer analysis, and here we go. It looks like Blackburn starts out a little bit differently here with e3. Maybe trying to be flexible, surprise his opponent, instead of playing the normal e4 move, or d4. So the game continues with Nimzowitsch responding also with a pawn push of only one square. So the game continues with f4 here, and we have the I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, the Vent Kruges opening. So it's kind of like a bird opening. The bird's opening, they push f4 immediately with white. Now there is a chance to be checked here, but I guess you could just block that with the knight. So the game continues with a counter strike here, and we have contact immediately between these two pawns. So Blackburn, he picks the best move. Why is this the best move? Well, you're capturing a valuable central pawn with a less valuable flank pawn. So now we have recapture. Black does have more space in the center. Blackburn, he decides to just develop a knight, and often it's good to develop knights before bishops as the knights are slower, and the knights are almost always well placed here on c3 or f3, f6 or c6 for black. And this gives you time to find out where you will best place your bishops. So the game continues with bishop to d6 being played. Now this is the best move in the position according to the computer, and black is slightly ahead here. He has more space in the center. I guess you could immediately try to attack the bishop and knock out the bishop pair, which is an okay strategy, but normally you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening unless you have a really good reason. So the game continues with e4 being played. An excellent move according to the computer, but the best move apparently is to just develop the other knight. And so what did this move accomplish? It equalizes space in the center with these two pawns. Also, it fixes this e5 pawn to the dark squares, blocking this bishop. So now we have a bad bishop here blocked in the center by pawns on the same colored squares. So the other bishop is developed, and Nimzowitsch is really breaking the general principles here of developing knights before bishops. But that's the thing in chess. You can follow general principles and they really help a lot. But as you get more experience, you'll know when you might want to break those rules and guidelines. And remember that they are just guidelines, but they can be good guidelines for a reason because they've been proven to work out well for people that follow those rules. So Blackburn developing the knights first, waiting to see where best to place his bishops. And now we have an interesting move, a mistake according to the computer. What's the purpose of this? Well, it prevents the knight from jumping forward here and harassing this bishop. It helps fortify this pawn in the center, but it does block this knight. I mean, I guess the knight can still go here, but then it prevents this bishop from retreating if it has to. So the game continues with d3, fortifying the e4 pawn. Computer says this is a missed opportunity, that immediately playing d4 would be better. Getting more space in the center and putting pressure on this pawn along with the knight. All right. The game continues with the knight developing the e7. And now we have the bishop centralizing here. This is another good strategy, placing a bishop in the center where it has two great diagonals here to attack on. And this also allows a possible queen push here, creating a battery of bishop and queen, which can come in handy sometimes. All right, pawn push. Now we have a kind of a reverse Maroczy bind situation. The Maroczy bind is usually when white in the Sicilian defense has a pawn on e4 and c4, really covering that d5 square. But here it's the opposite. The pawn is pushed forward, locking down this square, preventing that pawn from pushing forward. And that might be why the computer recommended immediately pushing that pawn. So the pawn structure is kind of fixed in the center, and unless this pawn pushes forward and tries to capture. So the game continues with the queen bishop battery being created here. There's not really much that can be done, because these pawns are really covering all of these squares that the bishop might try to go to. So the game continues with the knight developing and eyeing this potential outpost square here. And that's often a great strategy, is to look for a place to put your knight where it can't be attacked by pawns, or it's hard to be attacked by pawns. So if the knight jumps to d4, this pawn can't immediately push forward because the knight's in the way. And if the knight captures, the knight can't capture, or we would have a pawn recapture, and it would be forking the knight and the bishop. So that would force the bishop pair to be lost by giving up the bishop for the knight. So the game continues with more developing moves. The knight jumps into the outpost there. That is ignored in favor of castling, and that is another great way to get better at chess, is to definitely try to castle early and often, as if a king is in the center, it can be attacked from 3 different directions, straight on, or from the left or the right. But once it's castled, it can only be attacked from straight on or from one side, because nothing can come from off the board over here. Maybe something could attack from h2, but that's pretty fortified here. So another thing to look at here is that the knight could take the bishop, but this knight is on a good outpost here in the opponent's side of the board, and it's probably not a good idea to give himself up for this bishop. It would take out the bishop pair, but that bishop is a bad bishop blocked in by these pawns here in the center. So the game continues with castling by black, and now we have a knight remaneuvering here, maybe getting out of the way of this pawn to chase the knight on the outpost out of there. So the game continues with the other knight fortifying the knight on d4. So now maybe we could have capture And then after that knight's recaptured, the other knight could jump in there. And this is a great strategy. When you have a knight on the outpost, if you can put the other knight in behind it to fortify that knight on the outpost, so they kind of cover each other. But more importantly, if the first knight is knocked out, the second one can jump in there. All right. The pawn chases away the knight, and Bobby Fischer, the famous former world chess champion in 1972 to 75, he had a good strategy or belief that whenever an opponent got one of their pieces on your side of the board, you should definitely try and get rid of it. You don't want opponents' pieces just lingering on your half of the board, where they can be, more dangerous and cause potential problems. So the pawn is pushing this knight away. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, that c4 would have been best to just, keep the space even in the center. Now, even with this move, black is still ahead, either way with the c3 move, or if c4 was played, black would still be ahead. So the game continues with a capture, and now we have the bishop pair knocked out, the best move according to the computer. So queen captures, and the rook lines up here in the center on the queen. Now, even though all these pieces, bishop, pawn, and another bishop are in the way, you never know when the center could open up after a bunch of trades and you have a discovered attack by the less valuable rook on the more valuable queen. And that's another way to get better at chess. Line your less valuable pieces up on the more valuable ones. Either line up on the king or line up on the queen, or even line the bishop up on a rook. All right, so the game continues with the knight stepping to the side. Maybe, what did this do? It does allow the queen to move up here. Possible threat here. Oh, sorry, I was thinking the bishop was covering that, but it's not. So maybe more likely he wants to push this knight here. Although, if you go here, it weakens the king side a little bit. So let's see what happens. The bishop drops back here. So maybe there is a plan to push this pawn. And if you do that, it would create dark squared weaknesses around the king. And a good strategy would be to plug those holes with the bishop there where it can cover all that. So the knight does jump to the outpost. Now we have the king stepping to the side. Maybe because of the possibility of going here, and the knight could deliver a check. So let's see what happens next. White gains some space on the king side, launching a pawn forward, helping to further fortify the knight in case it's captured. The pawn could capture towards the center, which is a good general strategy, to capture with the pawns toward the center instead of away from the center. So the game continues with the battery being created. The queen has pushed forward. It creates this battery here, but what else does it do? It connects the rooks, giving these rooks more room to maneuver, especially if you want to move the other rook here and target this pawn, which is only protected by the queen at the moment. So we have the knight jumping forward, the best move in the position, because now one of the rooks can step over here, moving in behind the pawn to help protect it there with the queen. All right, pawn steps forward, grabbing space on the queen side. And modern day computers really love these moves, pushing the A pawns or the H pawns, these rook pawns up here, gaining space on the side of the board. So, what would a modern day computer recommend? Well, if we look at the analysis here, A4, keeping that space even. And that is not played by Blackburn. Apparently a4 would have been the best move. So now a4 could be played, gaining even more space. Also, computer recommends b5 as the number one move. So let's see what happens here. b5 is played. Now the computer's kind of changed its mind, recommending what? Saying c4 would have been better, which is interesting because that pawn could just be captured. The queen would be guarding it against a recapture by the bishop. So, game continues with the rook stepping to the center, lining up on the more valuable queen. And now we have the rook getting behind this pawn, which it probably plans to push forward. And that's a good strategy with your rooks. Place them on open or half open files. And if you don't have those immediately available, you could get behind pawns that you plan to push forward. So the game continues with the rook stepping up. Pawn pushes forward, and now we have exchange of pawns on the queen side. Instead of further exchanging, it looks like c4 is played, although the computer likes h4, just beginning a pawn storm here, pushing forward, trying to open things up around the king. So the game continues with rook to the open file. The queen steps forward here, and now we have rook on the 7th rank, which is usually a good principle. If you can get one or both of your rooks on the 7th rank, that's generally a good idea, especially if there's a lot of pawns. You can try and attack the pawns, although there's only two in this position, and they're both guarded. So computer actually likes g6, trying to chase this knight out of the outpost. The game continues with g5 being played, the best move in the position, trying to open things up against the opponent's king. Now we have a mistake. That may have been not the first mistake of the game, but maybe the first mistake by Nimzovich. No, it was his second mistake. So anyway, why is this a mistake? Let's find out. It is attacking the knight. So that is ignored in favor of this brilliant move here, sacrificing the knight to this pawn. What could happen then? The knight could jump onto this great outpost here, targeting the queen and the rook. So let's see how things continue. The knight is in fact captured, and that's a mistake. And now we have knight capturing pawn, attack here, forking the rook and the queen. The game continues with knight countering here, jumping onto the outpost. And that's interesting because another way to get better at chess, and this is a hard one, especially for beginners, is often beginners will come under attack and they get flustered and nervous and they think, oh, I have to get rid of this, I have to deal with this attack. Well, often if you can find a stronger counterattack or an equal counterattack to where it lets you ignore what your opponent is doing in favor of forcing them to deal with what you have in mind. So here the queen is under attack. Let's see how things continue. We have a retreat. The queen here also retreats, but now rook is captured, and that's an inaccuracy. Apparently, better would have been for the bishop to immediately capture here. So the game continues with queen recapturing. At this point, white is ahead. Now the knight is captured, and we have the pawn capturing. Instead of pawn capturing towards the center, we have a center pawn. It's still capturing in the center, but now white is left with two central pawns and black only has one. But the computer says that this is the best move to capture this way because, if they captured the other way, you would have this isolated pawn over here for black. Also, there'd be a passed pawn here that could try and move up the board. So the game continues with capture. We have a retreat. And At this point, white is ahead slightly here. He's ahead by a pawn, but the computer, gives him less than a pawn advantage at the moment. Now, we have rook for rook here, but white has a rook versus two bishops, and two bishops versus a rook is generally a little bit stronger there. So let's see how things continue. The queen was under attack. It steps forward, putting pressure on this pawn, but apparently that was a mistake. That, queen to h5. Looks like that would have been better, targeting the other pawn here with a threat of a check. So things continue with the queen lining up on the king. All right, so let's see how things continue here. This is a missed opportunity. Apparently, just queen up to f3 would have been better. So things continue with the rook dropping back, guarding the back rank, an inaccuracy. Apparently, rook to a6 would have been better. From here, the queen could help cover maybe this pawn push. This is pretty dangerous because this pawn is pinned to the king. Once again, a great example of how if you line up less valuable pieces on the more valuable pieces, if things start opening up, a discovered threat could occur. All right, the rook lining up on the queen here. The game continues with the bishop grabbing this nice open diagonal, but a mistake according to the computer. Apparently, bishop to e7 needed to be played, lining up on the queen. So now we have the queen stepping over, and this is a missed opportunity. The immediate g6 push targeting the queen would have been better. So the game continues with rook to the center. We have an exchange of rooks. The queen recaptures. An attack on the queen as the other rook grabs the open file. The game continues with queen lining up on the unprotected queen. And so the rook presses forward here, kind of blocking that line of the queen on queen there. So bishop drops back, a mistake. Apparently bishop to a4 would have been better. And what would that do? I guess maybe you have the option of preventing this pawn from coming forward, or even going here and targeting this pawn. So the game continues with finally this pawn pushing to g6, attempting to maybe pry open get rid of this final defensive pawn. Let's see what happens. It looks like queen to g7 is the best move here. We have a pawn capture. Computer does not like that. It also wanted queen to b7 with a threat of an attack on the king, perhaps. So the game continues with rook capturing here, and it's really looking dangerous. This king is just hanging out in the open. So the final moves are queen blocking here, preventing a check to the king. And now the queen drops back, the best move in the position. The game continues with the queen stepping forward, although bishop to d5, is preferred. Oh, wrong bishop. This one, bishop. Well, it's bad when... Oh, excuse me. Yeah, they're saying bishop to d5 would have been best. And I was going to say, it's bad when they want you to put your bishop on a square that it can just be captured on. All right, so the final moves are... The final move is the rook dropping back here. And there's a threat of, just going here, perhaps, pinning the queen to the king. So that's not looking so good. If this bishop tries to go here to cover that, well, then you can just deliver a check, and then a mate with the queen on the next move. So this is where Nimzowitsch resigned, and maybe it's a little earlier in Nimzovich's career. I think, this is 1914. In another 10 years, I think that's the period where he was one of the best players in the world. And so earlier in his career, but this was the last game I could find in the database of Joseph Henry Blackburn. His games are definitely worth taking a look at if you are an attacking player, as he was known for some good attacking chess. All right, well, feel free to leave comments, like, and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.